Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. It was the sort of crisp autumn afternoon that made St. Mary Mead appear even more picturesque than usual. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and red, a light wind rustling them across the cobbled high street. The scent of wood smoke and freshly baked apple tarts curled in the air, mingling with the faint tang of damp earth. Miss Jane Marple sat at her favorite window seat, hands gently folded over her lap, watching the village unfold its familiar routines. Across the way, Mrs. Bantry, clad in a smart navy blue coat, stood outside the greengrocer's, exchanging animated pleasantries with Mrs. Hargreaves. Young George Phelps, the butcher's boy, cycled past with a loaf of bread precariously balanced in his front basket, while Reverend Leonard Clement ambled along, his walking stick tapping against the pavement as he nodded to passers-by. But today was no ordinary day. Today was the Harvest Charity Auction, one of the most anticipated events of the season. This year's auction was being hosted at the grand estate of William and Margaret Pritchard, a couple who had moved to the village only a year prior, but had already made their presence keenly felt. Pritchard House, a sprawling Georgian estate set on the edge of the village, was an impressive sight. Its honey-colored stone facade gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the sweeping gardens, meticulously kept by a small army of gardeners, boasted bursts of dahlias, chrysanthemums, and late-blooming roses. The event was being held under large white marquee tents, with tables stacked high with homemade jams, hand-knitted shawls, antique trinkets, and even a set of silver candelabras. Miss Marple arrived punctually, her delicate steps making almost no sound on the gravel pathway. She was greeted at the entrance by Mrs. Margaret Pritchard, a tall woman with carefully arranged auburn hair and a polite but somewhat cool demeanor. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So lovely to see you. Do enjoy yourself. It's all for a good cause, of course." Miss Marple nodded. "A most commendable effort, I am sure." Mrs. Pritchard swept away to attend to another guest, leaving Miss Marple to observe the crowd. Villagers milled about the auction tables, admiring the offerings while exchanging the latest gossip. "Did you see who arrived with Mrs. Pritchard?" whispered Mrs. Bantry, sidling up to Miss Marple with an eager glint in her eye. Miss Marple smiled mildly. "No, my dear, but I am sure you are about to tell me." Mrs. Bantry's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Josiah Trent, the businessman, the one people say made his money in rather dubious ventures." Miss Marple cast a brief glance across the lawn. Josiah Trent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with slicked-back dark hair, stood near the refreshments table, speaking in hushed tones with William Pritchard. His expression was unreadable, but there was a distinct air of self-importance about him, as though he were accustomed to having people hang on to his every word. "And he is bidding in today's auction?" Miss Marple mused. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry said. "And quite competitively, I hear." The auction began in high spirits, with various items fetching impressive sums. Colonel Weston successfully outbid Dr. Haydock for a silver tea set. Mrs. Bantry won a delicate lace shawl, much to the disappointment of Miss Hartnell. And then, as the excitement reached its peak, the final item was unveiled. A golden locket. It was a delicate thing, gleaming softly under the lantern lights. The locket's surface was engraved with an intricate floral motif, and though it showed signs of age, it was remarkably well preserved. This lovely piece, Mrs. Pritchard announced, was found in the writing desk of Pritchard House. An Etoile heirloom, I should think. Perhaps a romantic history behind it? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several villagers moved forward to inspect the locket more closely. But it was Miss Beatrice Langley, the quiet and bookish owner of the village bookshop, who surprised everyone by placing the first bid. Miss Langley, normally shy and reserved, seemed almost breathless as she raised her hand. £5, she said firmly. A few villagers exchanged glances. Miss Langley was not known to be particularly wealthy, and such a bid was quite uncharacteristic of her. Josiah Trent chuckled, stepping forward. £7, he said smoothly. Miss Langley's fingers curled tightly around the hem of her coat. 8, 10, 11. The bids rose steadily, the tension thickening with each increment. Miss Langley's face had turned slightly pale, but there was a determination in her eyes, a desperation that was impossible to ignore. Finally, Trent's voice rang out once more. £15. A hush fell. It was a considerable sum. Miss E. Langley faltered. Her lips parted, as though she might counter once more. But then, with visible reluctance, she lowered her gaze. The gavel struck. Sold to Mr. Josiah Trent. A smattering of polite applause followed, but the moment felt oddly strained. Then, suddenly, Miss Langley swayed and collapsed. Gasps erupted. Mrs. Bantry let out a cry of alarm, and several guests rushed forward as Missy Langley crumpled to the ground. Dr. Haydock, who had been standing nearby, immediately dropped to one knee beside her. "She's fainted," he said, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist. "Pulse is weak, but steady." Mrs. Bantry fanned the unconscious woman with a folded pamphlet. The excitement must have been too much for her. Miss Marple, kneeling on the other side, studied Miss Langley's face. There was something beyond mere excitement at play. Anxiety, perhaps, or even fear. Slowly, Miss Langley's eyelids fluttered open. She blinked, dazed. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just felt lightheaded." Dr. Haydock helped her sit up. "No need to apologize, my dear, but you ought to rest." Miss Langley nodded, though she still appeared unsettled. Miss Marple noted how her eyes darted, just for a second, toward Josiah Trent. That night, the festivities wound down, the villagers parting ways with murmurs of curiosity lingering in the air. By morning, Josiah Trent was dead. Chapter 2. The afternoon light had begun to wane, casting a golden hue over St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple made her way along the cobbled High Street. Despite the picturesque setting, the quaint cottages with ivy-laced walls, the neatly trimmed hedgerows, and the distant sound of a milk cart rattling along the road, a distinct unease hung over the village. The death of Josiah Trent had disrupted the usual calm, and the whispers of suspicion had already taken root. People stood in small clusters outside their homes, speaking in hushed tones, and as Miss Marple passed, she caught snippets of their conversations. "They say poison," murmured Mrs. Hargreaves to her neighbor, shaking her head in disbelief. "Just like those crime stories from London." Terrible thing, Mr. Jenkins, the village postmaster muttered. But if you ask me, he had it coming. A man like that, always prying into other people's business. Miss Marple continued. On her way, her expression placid, but her mind sharp as ever. It was always fascinating, she thought, how quickly a crime turned the most ordinary of people into theorists and detectives. Her destination was the village bookshop, a modest establishment nestled between the bakery and the tailor's shop. The wooden sign above the door bore the faded gold lettering of Langley's Books and Stationery, and through the glass window the dim glow of lamplight illuminated rows of neatly arranged books. Miss Beatrice Langley was behind the counter, absent-mindedly, rearranging a stack of old volumes. Her usually composed face was pale, her fingers twitching slightly as she smoothed the covers. There was a tension in the set of her shoulders, a quiet unease that had not been there before. The small bell above the door chimed as Miss Marple stepped inside, and Miss Langley looked up with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin but polite. "Good afternoon." Miss Marple offered a kind smile. "Good afternoon, my dear. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Miss Langley quickly shook her head. "No, of course not. I was just tidying." Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward the books on the counter. They were already in perfect order. "Such dreadful news about Mr. Trent," Miss Marple said gently. "The village is quite shaken." Miss Langley hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it's shocking." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "I suppose you've heard what people are saying?" A flicker of something, unease, perhaps even fear, crossed Miss Langley's face. "People always talk," she said, her voice too even, too controlled. Miss Marple adjusted the gloves on her hands. "Quite so. But I imagine it must be especially difficult for you, given the circumstances of the auction." Miss Langley's fingers tightened against the edge of the counter. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You were very eager to win that locket." Miss Langley swallowed hard. "It was just a piece of jewelry." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but unwavering. "Or perhaps, my dear, it was something much more than that." Silence settled between them. Outside, the muffled sound of villagers passing by on the cobbled street filled the space. Inside, only the soft ticking of the bookshop's clock punctuated the quiet. Finally, Miss Langley exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I recognized it." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Go on." Miss Langley hesitated, as though weighing the risk of speaking the truth. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I've seen that locket before, in an old photograph, a photograph of my mother." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though she remained composed. "Your mother?" Miss Langley nodded, looking down as she spoke. "She died when I was very young. I never knew much about her past. She never spoke of it. But once, years ago, I found a photograph of her as a young woman, wearing that very same locket." Miss Marple's mind whirred. A lost family heirloom suddenly appearing in an estate auction, and then the winning bidder ending up dead the very next morning. "Did your mother ever mention where the locket had come from?" Miss Langley shook her head. "No. And when I tried to ask my father about it, he refused to talk about it. He got rid of the photograph soon after." She swallowed. "But I never forgot it. When I saw the locket at the auction, I knew I had to have it. It was like a missing piece of something I didn't even realize I needed to understand." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, absorbing the information. "And when you lost the bid?" she asked gently. Miss Langley exhaled shakily. I felt like something had been stolen from me all over again. She gave a weak smile. Ridiculous, isn't it? Miss Marple reached forward and patted her hand. Not at all, my dear. There is nothing ridiculous about wanting to understand one's past. Miss Langley hesitated. But it's gone now, isn't it? Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, and the person who took it knows exactly why. The silence that followed felt heavier, filled with unspoken thoughts and lingering questions. Miss Marple rose from her seat. You've been very helpful, Miss Langley. But do be careful. There are those who prefer the past to remain buried. Miss Langley looked down, nodding slightly. I understand. As Miss Marple stepped outside, she drew her shawl closer against the cool air. The village, though as peaceful in appearance as ever, now felt like a place full of secrets. This was no longer just a murder. This was about the past, and someone had been willing to kill to keep that past from coming to light. Chapter 3. The afternoon light had begun to wane, casting long shadows over the village as Miss Marple made her way down the narrow cobbled street. Though the air carried the comforting sense of fresh bread from the bakery and the distant tang of burning wood from cottage hearths, there was an unmistakable sense of unease lingering in St. Mary Mead. Josiah Trent was dead. The villagers, who only yesterday had been gathered in cheerful revelry at the charity auction, were now consumed with hushed whispers and speculation. Clusters of people stood outside shops, murmuring in low tones, pausing only when someone new approached. Miss Marple walked past the greengrocer's, where Mrs. Hargreaves and Mrs. Bantry stood in deep conversation. They say poison, Mrs. Hargreaves was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. Imagine that, right here in our village. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. And to think, I saw him bidding just last night, alive and well. Miss Marple didn't pause to join the conversation. She had already learned that when a crime such as this occurred, one was best served by listening rather than speaking, and there was someone in particular she intended to listen to today. The village bookshop was a quaint, tucked-away establishment with dark wooden shelves lined with well-thumbed copies of classics and histories. The gold lettering above the door read, Langley's Books and Stationery. Miss Marple stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and ink filling the air. Behind the counter, Miss Beatrice Langley stood sorting through a pile of old books. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, but her smile was tight, her eyes clouded with thought. Miss Marple, she said, her voice polite but strained. Good afternoon. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and approached the counter. Good afternoon, my dear. I thought I might stop by for a moment. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Such dreadful news about Mr. Trent. Miss Langley's fingers hesitated over the stack of books before her. Yes, she said, quietly. It's shocking. Miss Marple regarded her closely. People do love to talk, of course, she continued, her tone light. And it seems the whole village is quite intrigued by your interest in the locket. Miss Langley inhaled sharply, her grip tightening against the book she was holding. I suppose they would be. Miss Marple folded her hands, watching her. My dear, forgive me for being direct, but you were very determined to win that locket. Miss Langley hesitated, as though warring with herself, then sighed and carefully placed the book down. I recognized it, she admitted. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Go on. I've seen it before, Miss Langley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. In an old photograph. A photograph of my mother. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was already working. "Your mother." Miss Langley nodded, glancing down as she spoke. "She died when I was very young. I never knew much about her past. She never spoke of it. But once, years ago, I found a photograph of her as a young woman, wearing that very same locket." Miss Marple remained silent, letting the words settle. "I never knew what became of it." Miss Langley went on, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought it had been lost forever. And then, suddenly, it appears at the auction, found in Pritchard House, of all places." Miss Marple's sharp gaze softened slightly. "That must have been quite a shock for you." Miss Langley exhaled. "It was, and I had to have it. It was the only connection I had left to her." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against the polished wood of the counter. "And yet, my dear, the locket is missing." Miss Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now, Mr. Trent is dead." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. "You believe the two are connected?" Miss Langley hesitated, then swallowed. "Don't you?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I do believe, my dear, that coincidences in murder are exceedingly rare." Miss Langley nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "But if the locket was important enough for someone to kill for, what does that mean?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat. "It means, my dear, that this was never about the locket itself, but what it represents." Miss Langley looked down at her hands. "And I don't even know what that is." Miss Marple reached out and patted her arm gently. "But someone does." The bell above the door chimed again, and the conversation came to an abrupt halt as the shop door swung open. Standing in the entrance was William Pritchard. Tall, impeccably dressed in a dark overcoat, he had the air of a man accustomed to commanding attention. His gaze flicked between Miss Marple and Miss Langley before settling on the latter. "Miss Langley," he said smoothly, his voice polite but firm. "May I have a word?" Miss Langley tensed, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Pritchard. Monsieur." Marple stepped aside, pretending to browse the bookshelves, though she remained close. "Enough to hear." Pritchard lowered his voice. "I understand you were interested in the locket from last night's auction." Miss Langley nodded cautiously. "Yes." Pritchard exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I need to ask, why?" Miss Langley stiffened. "Because it belonged to my mother." Pritchard's jaw tightened. "I see." Miss Langley frowned. "Mr. Pritchard, why was it in your house?" Pritchard hesitated, then forced a smile. "It was simply something left behind by the previous owners. I assumed it was unimportant." Miss Langley studied him. "Unimportant?" Pritchard's smile faltered slightly. "Yes." Miss Langley's expression hardened. "Then why was Josiah Trent willing to fight for it?" Pritchard's fingers twitched slightly, betraying a flicker of unease. "That," he said slowly, "is something I'd very much like to know." Miss Marple, still browsing the shelves, allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Secrets were beginning to surface, and soon the truth would follow. Chapter 4. The village had taken on an unusual stillness by the time Miss Marple left Langley's bookshop. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets, and the usual bustle of St. Mary Mead had given way to something quieter, watchful, expectant. As she walked toward Elmwood House, Josiah Trent's now deserted residence, she noticed how quickly the villagers looked away when she passed. They were waiting for a suspect, a scandal, a solution. And Miss Marple had long understood that when a crime disrupted the rhythm of a small village, people did not truly want justice. They wanted a story. Inside Elmwood House, Inspectoress. Graves was directing his men with his usual gruff efficiency. The study, where Josiah Trent had been found slumped over his desk, remained largely untouched apart from the necessary removal of the body. A fine layer of dust still clung to the open ledger on the desk, the half-empty brandy glass beside it gleaming under the dim light of the afternoon. Miss Marple entered quietly, glancing around the room. "You again," Graves muttered, without looking up. "I should have known." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, Inspector, one does hear things." Graves sighed, rubbing his temple. "I suppose you've come to examine the scene?" "If it's not too much trouble," she said mildly. Graves gestured toward the desk. "Have at it, then. But I warn you, Miss Marple, this case is turning into a mess." Miss Marple moved toward the desk, her eyes scanning the surface with practiced ease. She had seen studies like this before, orderly on the surface, but hiding disorder underneath. "The brandy glass," she murmured, lifting it carefully. "Poisoned, you say?" Graves nodded. Dr. Haydock confirmed it. Likely a fast-acting variety, slipped into his drink sometime during the evening. Miss Marple set the glass down and turned her attention to the ledger. The entries were neat, methodical. Financial records, payments received, notes on transactions. Josiah Trent had not been a careless man. If he had enemies, they were the sort one made through business rather than passion. Her eyes flickered to the small key resting beside the ledger. "This key," she mused. "It wasn't in his pocket?" Graves shook his head. "No, it was left right there, in plain sight." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against the desk. "And you have not yet found what it unlocks?" Graves exhaled sharply. "We checked his desk drawers. Nothing unusual. No safe in the house, no strong box, nothing." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Then I suspect we are looking in the wrong place." Graves frowned. "And where do you suggest we look?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Not inside the house, Inspector, but outside of it." Graves straightened, narrowing his eyes. "You think this key leads somewhere else?" Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "It would be quite careless to leave something valuable in one's own home, wouldn't it? Particularly if one had reason to believe one might not be around. To guard it for much longer." A silence settled between them as Graves considered her words. Then he sighed. "Reed!" Constable Reed, a lanky young man with a perpetually nervous expression, hurried forward. "Sir?" "Get a team together," Graves ordered. "We're going to check the bank." Reed blinked. "The bank, sir?" Graves scowled. "Miss Marple believes this key belongs to something outside the house, and I have a feeling she's right." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, Inspector, you do flatter me." Graves shot her a look, but said nothing. Moments later, the group set off toward Much Benham Savings and Trust, the small bank serving St. Mary Mead and the surrounding areas. The air had grown cooler, the scent of damp leaves clinging to the wind as they walked. Miss Marple remained quiet, listening as Graves muttered under his breath about how inconvenient murders always were. Upon reaching the bank, they were greeted by Mr. Albert Henderson, the branch manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the cautious demeanor of someone who had spent his life balancing numbers rather than engaging in scandal. "Inspector Graves," Henderson greeted warily. "What can I do for you?" Graves pulled out the key, holding it up. "Did Josiah Trent have a safety deposit box here?" Henderson stiffened slightly, though he quickly masked it with a polite cough. Well, we do have confidentiality policies, Inspector." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Henderson, Josiah Trent was murdered last night. This is now a police matter." A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, with a resigned sigh, Henderson gestured for them to follow. "Come this way." Miss Marple and Graves were led into a small back room where rows of numbered safety deposit boxes lined the walls. Henderson scanned the labels, then reached for one near the middle. Sut 27. The key fit perfectly. Graves turned the lock and pulled the metal drawer open. Inside, resting atop a neat stack of papers, was a single item, a golden locket. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Ah." Graves carefully lifted it, turning it over in his palm. The engraving, intricate and delicate, caught the dim light. The very same locket that had disappeared from Josiah Trent's study after his murder. "But why hide it here?" Graves muttered. Miss Marple studied the papers beneath it, skimming through the neatly folded documents. Suddenly, her gaze sharpened. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this is a will." Graves frowned, taking the papers from her. As he read, his scowl deepened. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled. "I do believe we now know why Mr. Trent was killed." Graves exhaled sharply. "And who stands to gain the most from his death?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector. And I rather think it's time we paid them a visit." The case was unraveling, the past creeping back into the present. And soon, the murderer would have nowhere left to hide. Chapter 5. The heavy iron gates of Pritchard House stood slightly ajar as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple approached. The stately home, with its grand Georgian facade and sprawling gardens, seemed as imposing as ever. But now there was a different air about it, one that suggested someone inside had something to hide. Graves, gripping the recently discovered will in his gloved hand, muttered as they walked up the gravel path. "I knew this case would lead us back here. It always does with people like the Pritchards, moneyed folk who think they can play by their own rules." Miss Marple, ever composed, merely adjusted her shawl. Now, Inspector. One mustn't be hasty. Greed is a most universal trait, not limited to the well-off." Graves grunted, but said nothing more as they reached the large oak door. He rapped sharply 3 times, the knock echoing through the house. A few moments later, Margaret Pritchard opened the door, her poised expression faltering slightly when she saw them. "Inspector?" she said coolly. "Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Margaret's eyes flicked to the papers in Graves's hand. "I assume this isn't a social call." Graves stepped forward. "We need to speak with you and your husband. Now." Margaret hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Of course. Come in." They were led into the drawing room, a grand but carefully curated space filled with deep mahogany furniture and walls lined with oil paintings. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. William Pritchard was already inside, seated in an armchair, his gaze unreadable. Margaret took her place beside him, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Graves didn't waste time. He stepped forward, holding up the will. "We found this in Josiah Trent's safety deposit box." William Pritchard's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Margaret, however, merely raised a well-manicured brow. "And what does that have to do with us?" Miss Marple studied them both carefully. "It appears, my dear, that Josiah Trent was in possession of certain legal documents that might have been quite inconvenient for someone." Graves flipped through the pages of the will. "This document names a new beneficiary for a rather substantial inheritance." He looked up. A name that isn't yours, Mr. Pritchard. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, but William's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. Palatine fille. Marple's voice was gentle but firm. The locket from the auction, the one Josiah Trent fought so fiercely to obtain. It wasn't just jewelry, was it? It was a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that linked a certain family secret to this very house. William Pritchard exhaled through his nose, his knuckles white against the fabric of the chair. Graves leaned forward. Josiah Trent was murdered because of what he knew. And I think you both know exactly why. Margaret finally spoke, her voice as smooth as ever. Inspector, I don't know what wild theories you've cooked up, but I assure you, my husband and I have nothing to do with Mr. Trent's unfortunate passing. Miss Marple's smile was kind but knowing. Then, perhaps you could explain why the locket, once hidden within Pritchard House, disappeared after Mr. Trent's murder? A flicker of something passed over Margaret's face. So brief it was, almost imperceptible. Graves narrowed his eyes. Where is it, Mrs. Pritchard? Margaret gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. I have no idea. William cleared his throat. If I may, he said, his voice calm, measured. My wife and I had no reason to wish Mr. Trent harm. If this document changes anything, we were unaware of it. Miss Marple's gaze never left him. You see, Mr. Pritchard, that is what I find so interesting. The locket reappeared in an estate auction years after it was presumed lost. Mr. Trent was desperate to claim it, and Miss Langley, the bookshop owner, recognized it immediately. She tilted her head slightly. Now, why do you suppose that is? Margaret Pritchard's jaw clenched. Graves flipped another page in the will. Because the locket contained a clue to this very document. He tapped the paper. Josiah Trent had evidence that would have upended your inheritance, Mr. Pritchard. A long silence stretched between them. Then, at last, William exhaled and leaned back in his chair. What exactly are you accusing us of, Inspector? Graves crossed his arms. I'm accusing you of having a motive. Margaret let out a soft, dry laugh. Motive? Perhaps. But evidence, Inspector. You have none. Miss Marple smiled, ever patient. Not yet, my dear. Graves's scowl deepened. Then you won't mind if we search the house. Margaret stiffened slightly, but William only nodded. By all means, Inspector. You won't find anything. Graves gave a sharp nod to Reed, who signaled to the constables waiting outside. Within moments, they began methodically, searching the study, the library, the bedrooms. Miss Marple, however, moved at her own pace, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as if listening for the walls to whisper their secrets. She paused by the fireplace, her fingers brushing lightly against the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece. Tell me, Mr. Pritchard, she mused, who lived in this house before you? William hesitated. My father. And before him? He frowned. His father. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And in all that time, did anyone ever leave something behind? Margaret scoffed. If you're suggesting we've been sitting on some grand secret for generations, Miss Marple, I assure you. Her voice cut off abruptly, because in that moment, a shout came from upstairs. Inspector, you'll want to see this. Graves. And Miss Marple exchanged a glance before hurrying toward the source of the voice. They followed Constable Reed into a dimly lit study on the second floor, where an ornate wooden chest sat open. Inside, nestled among old documents, was a small velvet pouch. Graves reached for it and carefully emptied its contents onto the desk. A golden locket. The missing locket. Margaret Pritchard inhaled sharply. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward her, her expression unreadable. "Oh, dear," she murmured. "How very inconvenient." Graves turned back to the Pritchards, his jaw set. "Would either of you care to explain why the missing locket was hidden inside your house?" A tense silence followed. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, her voice quiet but firm. "You see, Inspector, the truth has a most peculiar way of revealing itself." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. William's face was pale, because the secret they had tried to bury was finally coming to light. Chapter 6. Heavy silence settled over the study as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple stood before the open wooden chest, the missing golden locket now gleaming on the polished mahogany desk. The weight of its presence in Pritchard House, after so much effort to conceal its whereabouts, seemed almost tangible. Margaret Pritchard had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly, though she quickly curled them into fists in an effort to steady herself. William Pritchard, seated rigidly in his leather armchair, remained silent, his expression unreadable. Graves folded his arms, his gaze flickering between them. "Well," he demanded, "would either of you care to explain why the very item that went missing after Josiah Trent's murder was found hidden inside your house?" Margaret inhaled sharply. "This is absurd," she said, her voice tight. "That locket was put up for auction. How would we have it now?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her sharp blue eyes twinkling. "Oh, my dear, I suspect you already know the answer to that." Margaret's jaw clenched. Miss Marple turned toward the desk, her gloved fingers brushing against the velvet pouch that had once held the locket. "You see," she continued, "the question isn't merely why this locket was hidden here, it's who took it after the auction, and why they wished it to disappear." Graves tapped a finger against the desk. "I assume you're suggesting one of the Pritchards stole it?" Miss Marple's smile was mild. "Not at all, Inspector. I rather think someone else stole it. But the Pritchards received it later." Margaret scoffed. "And what proof do you have of that?" Miss Marple turned toward her. "If you truly had no knowledge of this locket, Mrs. Pritchard, then tell me, why did you flinch when it was found?" Margaret's lips parted slightly, but she quickly masked her expression. "That's nonsense." Graves, however, wasn't so easily convinced. He narrowed his eyes at her. "I think it's time you stop playing games, Mrs. Pritchard. You know more than you're saying." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, as if to steady herself. William Pritchard, who had been unnervingly quiet, finally exhaled and leaned forward. "All right," he said stiffly. "We didn't steal the locket, but—" He hesitated. Margaret shot him a sharp look, but he ignored her. "We did receive it. Last night." Graves straightened. "From whom?" William sighed. "We don't know. It was left on our doorstep." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "At what time?" Margaret hesitated, then admitted, "We found it early. This morning, before the news of Trent's death had spread." A tense silence followed. Graves let out a humorless laugh. "So you expect me to believe that someone, a murderer most likely, decided to leave the locket on your doorstep for safekeeping?" William Pritchard met his gaze evenly. "I expect you to believe the truth, Inspector." Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. "And yet, Mr. Pritchard, one must wonder why you chose to hide it, rather than report it." Margaret exhaled through her nose. "Because we didn't want to be involved in this ridiculous scandal," she snapped. "We had no part in Trent's murder, but the moment we turned this over, we'd be dragged into it. Can you blame us for wanting to avoid that? Graves gave her a hard look. Yes, Mrs. Pritchard, I can. Miss Marple, however, was watching them with a gentler expression. Fear does strange things to people, she mused softly. And I suspect, dear Mrs. Pritchard, that you were afraid, but not for the reasons you claim. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple turned toward the locket on the desk. Whoever left this here last night knew what they were doing. They wanted it out of sight, and that suggests they were trying to hide their connection to it. Graves frowned. And yet, Miss Marple, we're still left with the question, who took the locket in the first place? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, I rather think the answer is simpler than it appears. She reached for the locket, turning it over delicately. The clasp had been worn slightly with age, but something small and distinct caught her attention. A faint smudge of red. Graves, noticing the way her eyes sharpened, immediately stepped closer. What is it? Miss Marple held the locket out to him. Lipstick. Margaret stiffened. Graves frowned, taking the locket and examining the smudge more closely. It's faint, but yes, looks like it rubbed off from someone's fingers. Miss Marple smiled kindly. And, my dear Inspector, I believe that tells us precisely who took it. Graves glanced toward Margaret, then back to Miss Marple. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. A woman took it. Margaret's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, true alarm flickered in her eyes. Graves exhaled sharply. Miss Langley, Margaret swallowed hard. That doesn't mean anything. Miss Marple merely smiled. On the contrary, my dear, I rather think it means everything. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but William Pritchard suddenly rose from his chair. That's enough, he said quietly. Margaret turned toward him, eyes wide. William, we can't cover for this any longer, he murmured. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she sank back into her chair. Mrs. Marple's expression remained serene, but inwardly she was already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. The locket, the will, the missing inheritance, and now the one woman desperate enough to take it. Inspector Graves straightened, his jaw set. It's time we had another talk with Miss Beatrice Langley. Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands gently in front of her. Yes, she murmured. I rather think she has quite a lot to explain. Chapter 7. The late afternoon sky over St. Mary Mead had darkened with rolling clouds, threatening rain as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple made their way toward Langley's bookshop. The village, usually bustling with quiet industry, now seemed subdued. Conversations were held in hushed tones, curtains twitched as they passed, and the air itself carried the tension of something just beneath the surface. At the bookshop, the door was locked. Miss Marple peered through the window, where the faint glow of a gas lamp illuminated the interior. Shelves lined with books cast long shadows, but there was no sign of Miss Beatrice Langley. Graves rapped on the door with firm knuckles. Miss Langley? Silence. Miss Marple's gaze drifted downward, where the welcome mat was slightly askew. Just beneath the edge, something caught her eye. Faint scuff marks on the wooden doorstep, as though someone had dragged their feet before entering. Graves knocked again, more forcefully this time. Still no answer. Miss Marple clasped her hands together. Inspector, I rather think we should take a look inside. Graves grumbled, but nodded, stepping back before giving the door a sharp shove with his shoulder. The lock gave way with a splintering crack, and the door swung inward. Inside, the bookshop was eerily quiet. The scent of old paper and ink lingered in the air, but something was off. The usual orderliness of the shop had been disturbed. A stack of books had toppled over near the counter, a chair was overturned, and behind the counter, a half-finished cup of tea had gone cold. Graves's eyes swept the room. Doesn't look like she left willingly. Miss Marple, ever observant, moved carefully through the space, her gaze flitting over the signs of disturbance. She bent down near the toppled books, picking up a small scrap of torn fabric. It was dark blue, fine wool, from a woman's coat. "Ah," she murmured. Graves frowned. "You recognize it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Miss Langley was wearing a dark blue coat yesterday. Was she not?" Graves exhaled sharply. So she was taken. Miss Marple turned toward the counter, where a ledger sat open, a page half filled with careful handwriting. The last entry was unfinished, the ink trailing off mid-word. She lightly touched the surface. It was still faintly damp. She was writing when it happened, she murmured. Interrupted suddenly. Graves pulled out his notebook. Which means whoever came for her didn't give her much time to react. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. But they didn't force their way in. Graves paused. "You think she knew them?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but certain. "I do?" A sudden creak from the floor above made them both freeze. Graves's hand went instinctively to his revolver. He motioned for Miss Marple to stay back as he moved toward the staircase, his steps cautious but firm. The house above the bookshop was Miss Langley's residence, a modest, sparsely furnished space where she had lived alone for years. Graves reached the landing and glanced down the hallway. There were only two doors, one leading to a small bedroom, the other to a study. Both were closed. Miss Marple, despite Graves's earlier warning, had followed quietly behind. Her eyes, ever sharp, scanned the hallway before settling on the study door. The handle was smeared with something dark. Graves saw it too. He reached out and pressed his fingers lightly against the stain. When he pulled them back, his expression darkened. "Blood." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Then I dare say, Inspector, we should prepare ourselves for something most unpleasant." Graves braced himself, then pushed the door open. Inside, the study was dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp. Papers lay scattered across the desk, as though someone had frantically searched through them, and in the center of the room, slumped against the bookshelf, was Miss Beatrice Langley. For a moment, everything was still. Then Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Oh dear." Graves hurried forward, kneeling beside the unmoving woman. A quick check of her pulse made him release a breath of relief. "She's alive." Miss Marple stepped forward carefully, noting the bruise forming along Miss Langley's temple. A heavy book lay on the floor beside her, the likely weapon. "She was struck," Miss Marple murmured. "Knocked unconscious." Graves shook his head. "But why? If they wanted her dead, they'd have finished the job." Miss Marple glanced around the room, her gaze landing on the desk. The top drawer was ajar, its contents in disarray. "I believe, Inspector, that they were looking for something." Graves straightened. "The locket." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Perhaps, or something even more valuable." At that moment, Miss Langley stirred. She let out a soft groan, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly regained consciousness. Graves crouched beside her. "Miss Langley? It's Inspector Graves. Can you hear me?" Her breath hitched. Then, with great effort, she whispered, "They took it." Graves frowned. "Took what?" Miss Langley's eyes, still dazed, locked onto Miss Marple. The letter. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but inwardly, her mind was already racing. What letter, my dear? Miss Langley swallowed hard. From my mother. A chill settled over the room. Miss Marple gently took her hand. Can you tell us what it said? Miss Langley's voice was barely a whisper. It proved everything. Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Proved. What? Miss Langley let out a shuddering breath. That I... She paused, then winced as pain shot through her head. That I was the rightful heir. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Ah. Graves's expression hardened. So that's what this is about. Miss Langley nodded weakly. Josiah Trent. He knew. He found out before I did. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but certain. And someone was willing to kill to keep that truth buried. Miss Langley's eyes fluttered shut again, exhausted from the ordeal. Graves stood, his hands curling into fists. We need to find that letter. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the rain had begun to fall in a soft, steady rhythm. Oh, Inspector, she murmured. I believe we already know exactly who took it. Chapter 8. Rain drummed against the windows of Langley's bookshop, casting thin rivulets down the glass as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves stood in the dimly lit study. The revelation from Beatrice Langley had shifted everything. This was no longer just about the murder of Josiah Trent or the mystery of the missing locket. It was about inheritance. It was about Beatrice Langley's past, and it was about the one person willing to kill to keep that past buried. Miss Langley had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her body exhausted from the attack. Dr. Haydock had arrived moments after she lost consciousness, again confirming that her injuries, though painful, were not life-threatening. But the missing letter, the one that proved Beatrice Langley was the rightful heir, was still gone, and now the only question that remained was, who had taken it? Inspector Graves paced, his hands clasped behind his back. The attack on Miss Langley confirms it, he muttered. Whoever killed Trent knew what he had uncovered and wanted it buried. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, folded her hands neatly in her lap. Oh yes, Inspector. And yet, what I find most interesting is that Miss Langley was not killed. Graves turned to her, frowning. You think that means something? Miss Marple's smile was mild. Oh, I do. You see, murder is quite final. But an attack, an act of intimidation, really, suggests something else. It suggests desperation. Graves exhaled sharply. So you believe the murderer didn't find what they were looking for? Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. They took the letter, yes, but I rather suspect that letter wasn't the true proof. Graves narrowed his eyes. Then what was? Miss Marple stood, moving toward the writing desk where Miss Langley had been attacked. The surface was still, in disarray, papers scattered, books knocked askew, but it was the ledger sitting open near the edge that caught Miss Marple's attention. She ran a gloved finger lightly across the page, then turned back to Graves. Tell me, Inspector, do you recall where we found the locket? Graves frowned. In the Pritchard's house, Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but more importantly, it was left there after Trent's death. She tapped the desk lightly. Which means it wasn't merely stolen, it was being hidden. Graves's scowl deepened. So, you're saying that whoever took the locket realized it was dangerous and tried to get rid of it? Miss Marple's expression was serene. Oh no, Inspector. I'm saying that whoever killed Josiah Trent didn't realize the locket contained proof of Beatrice Langley's identity until after they had already murdered him. A sharp silence followed. Then Graves let out a low curse. So, that's why the killer stole it after the auction. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. But they still had one problem. The letter. Trent must have found it before his death, and so they killed him for it. Graves folded his arms. Which means our murderer wasn't working alone. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. Or, more accurately, they had someone else who benefited from the crime as much as they did. The words settled over the room like a veil. Graves stiffened. The Pritchards? Miss Marple gave a small smile. Oh yes, Inspector. I believe it's time we had another chat with Margaret Pritchard. The storm had grown heavier by the time. They arrived at Pritchard House, the raindrops striking the windows like tiny fingers tapping on glass. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace did little to mask the tension, as Margaret Pritchard stood with her arms folded, her expression carefully composed. William Pritchard was seated in his usual chair, his hands resting on the arms, his knuckles pale. Graves wasted no time. We've had some new information, Mrs. Pritchard. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Have you? Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm and measured. We've discovered that the letter proving Beatrice Langley's rightful claim to an inheritance has gone missing. Margaret's lips barely parted, but Miss Marple did not miss the slight intake of breath, the way her eyes darted, for the briefest moment, toward her husband. Missing? Margaret said, her voice even. And you believe we have it? Missy, Marple's smile was gentle. Oh, I do believe you've seen it, my dear. But I rather think you were not the one who stole it. Margaret's fingers twitched slightly. William Pritchard's expression darkened. Graves stepped forward. Mrs. Pritchard, where were you last night? Margaret blinked. I was here, of course. Graves nodded. And what about your husband? A silence. Then, slowly, Margaret turned her gaze toward William. Miss Marple took the moment of hesitation to press forward. You see, Mrs. Pritchard, the problem is the locket. Margaret stiffened. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but certain. You claimed it was left on your doorstep, but we both know that isn't true. William's jaw tightened. This is absurd. Miss Marple lifted a finger. Not at all, Mr. Pritchard. Because, Chapter 9. A sharp silence gripped Pritchard House as William Pritchard stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. The crackling fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the room, but its warmth did nothing to soften the cold realization settling over his wife's face. Margaret Pritchard's voice was barely above a whisper. You killed Josiah Trent. William's jaw worked as though he wanted to protest, to refute the accusation outright, but he didn't. Inspector Graves took a step closer, his voice sharp. It's over, Pritchard. We know everything. Margaret's breathing was uneven as she turned to Miss Marple. Why? She asked, though the question wasn't directed at the detective. Why would he do such a thing? Miss Marple studied William Pritchard carefully. He had the look of a man whose mind was turning, calculating, trying to find an escape, an explanation that might absolve him. But there was none. Because he knew, Miss Marple said softly. Margaret blinked, shaking her head. Knew what? Miss Marple folded her hands. That Beatrice Langley was the rightful heir to the estate that your husband inherited. Margaret stiffened. That's not possible. But Miss Marple only smiled gently. Oh, but it is, my dear. and Josiah Trent found the proof. Graves unfolded the will that they had found in the bank's safety deposit box. He held it up. Trent wasn't trying to steal from you. He was trying to set things right. William's breathing was heavy. His eyes were fixed on the fire, as if hoping it might consume the reality he was now facing. Miss Marple took a step toward him. "Tell me, Mr. Pritchard, did you know the truth before, or did you only realize it once the locket resurfaced?" William's mouth twitched, and for a moment he looked as if he might deny everything. But then, slowly, he exhaled. "I knew." Margaret let out a soft, broken gasp. William's gaze flickered to her, then back to Miss Marple and Graves. "I suspected for a long time," he admitted. "But there was no proof, nothing to challenge my inheritance." Then Trent came along, sniffing around, asking questions. "I should have gotten rid of him then." Graves clenched his jaw. "But you didn't." William gave a humorless laugh. "No, because I didn't think he'd actually find anything." His eyes darkened. "But then he did." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And what did you do when you realized that Josiah Trent had proof of Miss Langley's inheritance?" William's gaze flickered toward his wife, then back again. He knew he had nothing left to lose. "I killed him." Margaret's breath hitched. "William," but he ignored her. His voice was steady, almost detached. "I went to his house the night of the auction. I confronted him. I told him he had no right to interfere." Graves's grip on his notebook tightened. "And then?" William exhaled. He wouldn't listen. He said the law was the law, that he would take the matter to the courts, that everything I had built, everything I had inherited, would be gone. Margaret's voice wavered. "So you poisoned him?" William let out a small, bitter chuckle. "I didn't plan to." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure beginning to slip. "I only meant to warn him. I wanted to scare him." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but firm. "But he didn't frighten easily, did he?" William shook his head. "No. He was too proud, too sure of himself." Graves's voice was sharp. "So you slipped the poison into his brandy." A long silence stretched across the room. Finally, William nodded. "It was quick," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I told him we could come to an agreement. I poured the drinks. He never even noticed." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "You—" She shook her head, unable to find the words. Miss Marple sighed softly. "And when he died, you searched his house." William's eyes flickered toward her, and she knew she had struck true. "Yes," he admitted. "I thought the IE proof would be there, but it wasn't. So I took the locket instead, hoping that somehow it would lead me to it." Graves nodded grimly. "And when you realized it wouldn't?" William's jaw tightened. "I tried to get rid of it. I planted it at my house, hoping to throw suspicion elsewhere." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "But then the letter resurfaced, and Beatrice Langley, poor innocent Miss Langley, had it in her possession." William's fingers curled into fists. "I had no choice." Margaret flinched as though she had been struck. "You attacked her," William exhaled. "I needed that letter." Graves stepped forward. "You nearly killed an innocent woman, Pritchard." William did not deny it. Miss Marple watched him carefully, and yet, in the end, none of it mattered. Because the truth always finds its way to the surface. William lowered his head. The weight of his crimes, the life he had tried so desperately to protect, had finally come crashing down. Graves Moyface nodded to the constables at the door. "William Pritchard, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Josiah Trent and the attempted murder of Beatrice Langley." Margaret let out a shuddering breath, but she said nothing as her husband was led away. Miss Marple turned toward her, her expression unreadable. "You knew, didn't you?" Margaret didn't answer at first. Then, finally, she whispered, "I suspected." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "I thought as much." Margaret swallowed hard. "I just didn't want to believe it." Chapter 10. The storm had passed by the time Miss Marple stepped out of Pritchard House, leaving the air crisp and damp with the lingering scent of rain. The village, which had been buzzing with speculation and whispered accusations, had grown eerily silent. St. Mary Mead was always quick to move on from a scandal, but there was something about murder that left behind an uncomfortable residue, one that couldn't be swept away with polite conversation and warm cups of tea. Inspector Graves walked beside her, his expression still grim. "It's always the same, isn't it?" he muttered. "All for money, all for status, a man willing to kill just to keep what wasn't his." Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl, smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I do believe you're oversimplifying." "Things," Graves frowned. "Am I?" Miss Marple nodded. "You see, greed is rarely about wealth alone. It is about fear. The fear of losing something one believes to be rightfully theirs. In Mr. Pritchard's case, it wasn't just money at stake. It was his entire identity." Graves exhaled sharply. "And he still lost everything." Miss Marple sighed. "As they always do, Inspector, because the truth has a way of catching up, no matter how tightly one tries to bury it." They had barely made it to the main street when a familiar figure emerged from the bookshop's doorway. Beatrice Langley, still pale but upright, stepped hesitantly onto the cobblestones. She had spent the past few hours under Dr. Haydock's care, recovering from the attack that could have cost her life. "Miss Ethies," Marple approached her gently. "My dear, you should be resting." Beatrice gave a weak smile. "I couldn't just stay inside, not after everything." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "It's truly over, then?" Graves nodded. "William Pritchard confessed. He killed Trent to keep your inheritance a secret. He thought if he silenced him, he could protect his claim to the estate." Beatrice inhaled slowly. "And the letter?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Oh, my dear, you mustn't trouble yourself with that any more. The letter was a key, yes, but the truth is out now. The law will recognize what was meant to be yours all along." Beatrice bit her lip. "It feels strange." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Strange?" Beatrice hesitated, then sighed. "I never wanted any of this. I wasn't looking for an inheritance. I just wanted to understand my past." Miss Marple reached for her hand, patting it gently. "And now you do, my dear. And that is a most precious thing." Beatrice's eyes shimmered slightly, but she quickly looked away. "And Mrs. Pritchard," Graves's expression darkened. "She claims she didn't know. I'm inclined to believe her. She suspected, but she wasn't part of the murder. Legally speaking, she'll be fine." Miss Marple sighed. "Yes, though I imagine she will find that her life is never quite the same." A beat of silence followed, filled only by the distant toll of the village clock. Then Beatrice took a deep breath. "And what about the locket?" Graves frowned. "It was just a trinket, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a small smile. "Not quite, Inspector," She reached into her pocket and carefully pulled out the delicate golden locket, the very same one that had caused so much trouble. She had retrieved it after the arrest, knowing that, in the end, it didn't belong to the police. Beatrice's eyes widened. You kept it?" Miss Marple nodded. "It belonged to your mother, my dear, and I do believe it belongs to you now." A small, strangled sound left Beatrice's throat as she reached forward, taking the locket into her hands as though it might vanish if she didn't hold on to it tightly. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then, ever so gently, she traced her fingers over the engraved floral design. "My mother wore this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She held it. It was hers. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Yes, my dear. And now it is yours." Beatrice swallowed hard, then, after a moment, clicked it open. Inside, beneath a thin pane of glass, was an old photograph. A young woman, smiling, full of life. Beatrice's mother. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, but this time she did not turn away. This time she let them fall. Miss Marple patted her hand once more before stepping back. "You have your truth, Miss Langley. And now you have your past." Graves cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well then, I suppose that's that." Miss Marple turned to him, her expression twinkling. "I suppose it is, Inspector. Until the next time, of course." Graves groaned. "Heaven help me, Miss Marple, but I have no doubt there will be a next time." Miss Marple chuckled, and for the first time in what felt like days, the weight that had settled over St. Mary Mead began to lift. Justice had been served. The past had been uncovered. And though life in the village would never quite be the same again, for Beatrice Langley, a new chapter was just beginning. Miss Marple sighed. "Few people ever do, my dear." The house fell into silence once more, but this time it was final. The mystery was solved. The murderer had confessed. But for those left behind, there would always be a price to pay.